Welcome to the debate. Today we are looking at, a pretty brutal contradiction in the modern labor market. Society tells you that your worth as a human is inherent, right?
Right, of course.
But then the algorithmic pipeline that actually controls your livelihood, it basically says you only exist if you have the data to prove it.
Exactly. I mean, you're standing there a fully realized human being with decades of complex lived experience, but if you lack the specific quantifiable documentation that the institution is scanning for, you are completely invisible to it.
And that tension, that exact tension, is the foundation of our discussion today. We are diving into a specific framework from Module 9 of the Living Professional Record, or, the LPR Academy curriculum.
The famous Module 9.
Right. The module is titled Advisor Mindset, Scope, and Practice Boundaries. And specifically, we are examining their central philosophical doctrine. It's known as the dignity before the record.
Which is a bold claim, honestly.
It is. The text explicitly states that while systems constantly ask for proof before opportunity, proof is not dignity. Like, a person isn't less worthy because they are unemployed or caregiving or, working informal jobs.
It's a very radical stance. They explicitly say, the worker does not serve the record, which, that brings us to the core disagreement we're tackling. We're debating whether the LPR method's strict rules and procedural boundaries actually succeed in protecting a worker's dignity. Or, and this is where I land, if the very mechanics of the method force the worker to, subordinate their human worth to the system's relentless demand for evidence.
Right, and I take the position that the LPR method successfully creates a protective barrier. By enforcing a really rigid scope for its advisors and maintaining that the client wholly owns their underlying data, it acts as a critical buffer, a buffer between human dignity and a labor market that just relentlessly demands empirical proof.
And my position is that despite the noble philosophy, the operational reality of the LPR method actually undermines it. Because the method requires workers to meticulously inventory their evidence and map out defensible proof, it inherently entangles their human dignity with their ability to produce documentation. You just cannot decouple the two when the entire process is built around serving the system's demands.
Let me ground my perspective in how this actually functions on the ground. We have to look at the LPR method as essentially building an API, like an application programming interface, but between the human and the market.
Okay, an API.
Yeah. The LPR Academy instructs its certified living professional record advisors, the CLPRAs, that they cannot promise employment outcomes, period. They don't guarantee interviews. They do not guarantee you will beat the applicant tracking software. And look, I know critics say this is a cop-out, but it isn't. It is a structural mechanism of protection.
I mean, telling someone you can't help them get a job when they need a job feels a bit...
But they are helping them, just not by making false promises. By entirely removing the promise of market acceptance, the method actively insulates the client's self-worth from inevitable market rejection. The doctrine is source before surface. The client owns the messy, complex truth of their life. The advisor simply helps format specific data points for the market software to read. The advisor refuses to act as a cheerleader or a life coach or, a therapist. That strict restraint is what stops the client from being reduced to a mere employability score.
The API analogy is clever, I'll give you that. But I look at the module's doctrine and I see a glaring contradiction. The text says beautifully that a person is not more worthy because they have stronger evidence.
Right.
Yet the literal job description of an LPR advisor is to help clients capture records, build evidence, and assess what they call claim maturity. I mean, come on.
Let's unpack claim maturity for a second, though. We are talking about taking a statement a worker wants to make, like, say, I managed a team, and determining how well-backed that statement is by verifiable evidence, right?
Right. And you cannot separate the philosophy from that mechanic. If the advisor refuses to optimize a resume without source material to back it up, the worker is still forced to play a game where a lack of proof directly translates to a lack of opportunity.
But that's just reality.
Is it? You can call it an API, you can call it a boundary, but the worker with undocumented labor or a caregiving gap is still structurally disadvantaged. The advisor's procedural steadiness might be, polite, but it doesn't change the cold reality that the record dictates the worker's power.
But intellectualizing that reality is exactly the point. Look, if the advisor doesn't intellectualize the pain of the market, the client internalizes it. Let's look at the anti-drift rules in the text.
Okay.
Advisors are trained never to drift from evidence and to hype. If a claim is unsupported, they are mandated to pause. Imagine you have an advisor who hypes a client up, you're amazing, you're going to get this job, let's brand you as a visionary, and then the market rejects them. What happens?
To get disappointed, obviously.
Worse than disappointed. The client thinks, I guess I'm not a visionary. I guess I'm worthless.
Well, that assumes the alternative provided by the LPR is somehow less alienating, and I just don't think it is. Let's look at the actual client scenarios in the module. A client comes in experiencing what the text brilliantly calls silence fatigue.
It is a great term.
It really is. They are desperate, they are exhausted by automated rejections, and they say, the whole system is broken, nothing matters, I just need a job. Now, the advisor is instructed to offer an LPR-aligned response, right? They pivot to focusing on what they can govern, which is evidence, context, claims.
Which, frankly, is the only honest response you can give.
Honest, maybe, but mechanically, it functions as a bureaucratic pivot. You have a human being sitting in front of you with a very raw, very real struggle to survive, and the advisor responds by redirecting them to administrative tasks. Let's focus on your claim maturity and privacy labeling. I mean, that clinical restraint takes human suffering and just quarantines it into a data entry exercise.
See, I disagree completely on the psychological impact of that quarantine. Let me explain the actual mechanism of relief here. When a client says the market is broken, the advisor validates that by saying, yes, the system is low feedback and hostile. They name the systemic failure out loud. Then, they force the client to physically link a past project to an evidence tag in their private database.
And how does clicking a tag in a database heal silence fatigue? Seriously.
Because of the visual, tangible uncoupling of worth from the resume. In that moment, the worker sees their value existing permanently and safely on their own terms. The public resume might get rejected by a recruiter today, sure, but the source evidence remains intact. The relief comes from realizing, my history is real, regardless of whether this specific algorithm validates it today. The restraint of the advisor prevents the client from taking the silence of the market as a verdict on their personal value.
Okay, you say giving them agency over their evidence is empowering, but that brings up a glaring mechanical problem. If we are orienting their evidence before we optimize it, which is the rule, what happens when their lived experience simply doesn't produce the defensible evidence the system demands?
Give me an example.
The caregiving gap, it's a scenario directly addressed in the module. A client asks, can we hide my gap? Or can I claim leadership for managing my household? The LPR method emphasizes orientation before optimization, right?
Yes.
You don't just shove keywords into an application, you diagnose the problem. The advisor must limit the rendering to what is defensible. So if a worker has a 3-year caregiving gap, they lack mature claims for corporate leadership.
Right, because managing a household, while incredibly difficult and valid, and I mean that, it does not map to the specific evidence required for corporate management lean.
Exactly. And by strictly enforcing that a claim must be defensible in the corporate sense, the advisor becomes the enforcer for a system that devalues informal or interrupted labor. The LPR method leaves that caregiver disadvantaged. It completely clashes with the module's own philosophy that caregiving periods aren't empty.
Walk me through what you think the advisor should do in that scenario then. Should they lie? Should they artificially inflate the caregiving gap with corporate jargon to trick the applicant tracking system? Call them a domestic CEO?
No, I'm not suggesting fraud.
Because that's what a lot of traditional career coaches do, and it backfires.
I know it does. I'm not saying lie. I am pointing out that the methodology cannot protect the client's dignity from the market's judgment. The market still judges the gap.
But it does protect them mechanically. Let's play out how a CLBPR actually maps that gap in the LPR. They don't try to dress it up as household CEO. That's the exact hype we talked about avoiding. Instead, they look at the doctrine of privacy before proof.
Okay.
The text provides the exact response for this. It says, we can decide how much context belongs in public materials and what should remain private. The record can preserve the gap context safely, and the rendering can focus on supported evidence without overexposing personal details.
Wait, let's unpack the rendering here, because this is important. We are talking about the physical output, right? The resume, the public profile, the stuff generated from the private database.
Correct. The client owns the private database, the root. The rendering is just the surface export. The LPR isn't punishing the caregiver for the gap. It is protecting them from unsafe exposure. It finds the strongest truthful signal they possess from their other experiences and formats it for the specific industry vocabulary they are targeting. I think that is highly ethical. It goes back to the text of Clip 7. A person is not less worthy because they are underemployed, underdocumented, interrupted. The record serves the worker.
Look, reading the philosophy out loud is moving, but the friction remains. If a person is truly not less worthy because they are underdocumented, why must they engage in this incredibly complex documentation process just to survive? The philosophy says the record serves the worker, but to maintain this API, the worker has to continually feed the machine.
They are feeding their own machine, not the employer's. This is the crucial distinction about client ownership. The module dictates that the LPR must not become surveillance. It explicitly forbids the record from becoming an employer dossier. Traditional corporate HR systems treat the worker as data to be mined. The LPR flips that. It gives the worker total sovereignty.
Hold on, let's stop right there. You're saying self-managed surveillance isn't surveillance, but if I am the one holding the whip, I am still getting whipped. Walk me through mechanically how the advisor practice rhythm actually plays out in a worker's daily life.
The rhythm is clearly defined. It's orient, scope, capture, classify, map claims, apply privacy, check AI use, translate market lane, render, revise, maintain.
Listen to that list. Even if the advisor is guiding this, the worker is forced into a state of constant self-auditing just to maintain a living record. They finish a project on a Tuesday afternoon, and instead of just moving on with their life, they have to assess it. Can this be classified? Can this be mapped into a mature claim? Does this fit my market lane? The psychological burden of auditing your own life means the worker is in fact serving the record. They are internalizing the market's panopticon. They literally commodify their own memories.
That implies the LPR is introducing the surveillance. Let's be real here. We already live in a panopticon. Workers are scraped, assessed, and scored by automated systems whether they maintain an LPR or not. The LPR method isn't introducing the scrutiny, it is introducing governance over it.
But it changes the worker's relationship with their own past.
To a relationship of control. Go back to the API analogy. You aren't changing your underlying source code. You are just meticulously formatting the data export so that when the market software pings you, you reply with governed, accurate data rather than, well, a desperate plea. When the text talks about checking AI use, it means the worker ensures their truth isn't hallucinated or distorted by a machine before it goes to market. Doing the hard work of inventorying your evidence is exactly what prevents you from relying on the whims of an algorithm.
I understand the desire for control. I do. But look at the power dynamics. The module insists on diagnosing whether a problem is a surface rendering issue or a root evidence issue. But what if the problem is neither? What if the problem is systemic bias?
Well, the advisor is constrained by scope. They can't fix the market.
Exactly. They cannot offer legal advice on discrimination. They cannot change an employer's arbitrary credential demands. They can only tell the worker to fix their record. When the only tool you have is evidence governance, every problem looks like a rendering issue. This places the burden of navigating a hostile market entirely onto the shoulders of the individual worker's ability to document their past.
I have to push back hard on that, because the LPR method explicitly acknowledges those systemic failures out loud to the client. That is the exact mechanism of the no employment guarantees rule we talked about earlier. The advisor is trained to look the client in the eye and say, a client may build a strong record and still face bad timing, age bias, geographic limits, or inaccessible networks. By naming those systemic issues as outside the scope of the record, the advisor actively relieves the worker of the burden of internalizing them.
Do they, though?
Yes, if you get rejected, it might just be age bias. It's not your fault and it's not a flaw in your dignity. That separation is profoundly protective.
It is protective in theory, but let's look at the tiering of advisors in the module. You have Tier 1 for basic evidence inventory, moving all the way up to Tier 4 for advanced application support and highly complex job-specific renderings. If dignity comes before the record, why do we have an escalating monetized hierarchy of professional record builders?
Because evidence complexity scales. It's just a practical reality.
Yes, but it inherently commercializes the translation of human worth into market value. The more complex your intersection with the labor market, say you have NDAs or mixed freelance work or informal labor, the higher tier of advisor you need to translate your lived experience into these defensible claims. Even if the advisor doesn't promise a job, the entire enterprise rests on the premise that better documentation yields better market navigation. You cannot divorce the psychological reality of paying a Tier 4 expert to map your life from your sense of dignity.
You are demanding that the LPR method solve capitalism, which is explicitly outside its scope. The module is incredibly clear. The LPR Academy teaches a method for records management. It does not certify universal career expertise. The existence of tiers just acknowledges that someone with 20 years of intertwined intellectual property requires more sophisticated data mapping than a recent college graduate. The absolute refusal to cross into life coaching or therapy is what keeps this from being a grift.
I'll agree that the refusal to engage in hype is a breath of fresh air in the career services industry. But let's look at the ultimate impact on the client's narrative. Take the client who asks the advisor, "Just tell me what career I should go into." The advisor responds that they cannot decide the client's life direction, but they can use the record to create positioning hypotheses and test them against market language.
Right. They use the evidence to see what lanes are actually viable. It's empirical.
But this reliance on market language is the trap. The worker's aspirations must always be translated into the vocabulary of the institution. What if a worker's most dignified, meaningful work doesn't map onto a recognized market lane? The LPR method struggles to render it. The worker's truth is forced through a funnel of institutional legibility.
Translation into institutional legibility is a requirement for survival in the modern economy. It just is. It is not a degradation of dignity to speak the language of the system you are trying to navigate. The LPR method makes that translation explicit and governed rather than chaotic and desperate. The Academy draws a hard line. The CLPR certification is strictly about system competence and truth. The client always knows they are building a governed database of fact, not a manufactured marketing brochure.
Sure, but human lives are not just metadata and mature claims. By hyper-focusing on empirical, source-backed evidence, we strip away the narrative arc that gives a career its actual human meaning. I mean, think about it. The connective tissue between two entirely different jobs is often purely narrative. It's a leap of faith, it's a personal transformation, or a sudden realization. The LPR method's insistence on empirical evidence risks flattening the human experience into a sterile database. It protects the worker from being caught in a lie, sure, but it absolutely prevents them from telling their truest, most human story.
It doesn't prevent them from telling the story. It ensures that when they tell that story, it is anchored to reality so it cannot be dismantled by a skeptical system. It provides the empirical foundation upon which any narrative must rest if it's going to survive the scrutiny of an algorithm.
And there it is, surviving the scrutiny of the system. The entire architecture of the living professional record is built around anticipating the gaze of the institution.
Well, let me summarize my position as we wrap up here. The LPR Academy's Module 9 offers a highly ethical, desperately needed mechanical framework for navigating a hostile labor market. By enforcing strict scope, refusing to guarantee employment outcomes, and quarantining the pain of the market from the reality of the evidence, it provides workers with a structured way to survive. It honors the doctrine from Clip 7 that human dignity comes before the record by uncoupling a person's worth from their resume and giving them true ownership over their data.
And to summarize my perspective, while the LPR method clearly attempts to ethically protect the worker, its core mechanics cannot escape the gravity of the market, dictating that
proof is not dignity is a beautiful philosophy, but the rigorous daily demands of evidence inventory, claim mapping, and translating your life into market lanes ultimately forces the worker into a state of perpetual self-surveillance. The method inadvertently requires the worker to conform to the system's metric of worth just to remain visible.
The source material certainly presents a profound challenge to how we view employability in the modern age. The tension between the philosophical goals of dignity before the record and the procedural reality of mapping it out is incredibly nuanced.
Absolutely. It forces us to ask whether any methodology, no matter how strictly governed or ethically designed, can truly insulate a human being from a system that only values data.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of the LPR API we've been discussing today. You can build the most meticulously organized, perfectly governed interface to translate your life for the market. It might even get you the job. But the real question remains, when you finally unplug from the machine, do you still know how to read your own worth without looking at the screen?